My name is Paige, and exactly 7 days after signing my final divorce papers, I found myself standing in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Four Seasons Hotel, watching my ex-husband marry his absolute dream woman. Most people would call me crazy for attending the wedding of the man who just broke my heart, but I had my reasons for being there. The room was drowning in thousands of imported white orchids and illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the city's financial elite. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. It was a spectacle of wealth and arrogance, perfectly tailored to Bradley. He was a man who spent our entire marriage reminding me that my career in forensic accounting was boring compared to his high-stakes world of investment banking. I stood in the corner taking in the sheer excess of the celebration when a familiar and highly unwelcome presence approached me. I was standing near a massive ice sculpture trying to remain invisible when a sharp voice cut through the ambient noise of the string quartet. It was Beverly. My former mother-in-law descended upon me wearing a sequined gown that cost more than my first car. She carried 2 glasses of champagne and shoved the smaller, noticeably less bubbly glass directly into my hand. She smiled that tight, venomous smile she had perfected over the years. She told me to drink up because it was the cheap house wine they reserved for the Tier 3 guests, who did not make the cut for the VIP tables. Beverly always knew exactly how to deliver an insult wrapped in fake politeness. She stood uncomfortably close to me, reeking of heavily applied floral perfume and absolute judgment. Beverly did not waste a single second before launching into her favorite topic of conversation, which was my complete and utter failure as a wife. She took a delicate sip of her premium champagne and gestured toward the dance floor. She told me I really should take notes tonight. She said I might finally learn how a real woman is supposed to act. She reminded me for the 100th time that my fatal flaw was my obsession with my job. According to Beverly, no successful man like Bradley wanted a wife who came home at 9 o'clock at night smelling like stale office coffee and rambling about tax fraud and offshore routing protocols. She said a man like Bradley needed a soft, nurturing, high society woman who understood how to host galas and manage a household staff. She told me I was nothing but a cold calculator who cared more about spreadsheets than serving her husband. Then Beverly pointed her perfectly manicured finger toward the elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. She told me to look at Madison. She described Madison as the ultimate catch. A gorgeous, elegant trust fund heiress who came from old money and knew exactly how to treat a man of Bradley's stature. Beverly gushed about Madison's supposed pedigree, claiming her family owned half the real estate in Manhattan and possessed a trust fund so massive it made Bradley's investment portfolio look like pocket change. Beverly leaned in closer and whispered that Bradley had finally found someone in his own league, someone who understood high finance without having to work a gritty desk job to comprehend it. She finished her tirade by suggesting I drink my cheap champagne quickly and leave before I embarrassed myself further. I let Beverly talk because reacting was exactly what she wanted. I turned my gaze toward the front of the room where the new bride was holding court. Madison was standing under a spotlight wearing a custom silk designer gown that clung perfectly to her figure. She was laughing delicately, holding a crystal flute of champagne and surrounded by a circle of Bradley's wealthy finance brothers who were all hanging on to her every word. She played the part of the innocent wealthy socialite flawlessly. She had the graceful posture, the bright sparkling eyes, and the demure smile of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. Bradley was standing right next to her, puffing out his chest and looking like he had just won the lottery. He looked so incredibly smug, showing off his ultimate trophy wife to his entire network of Chicago investment bankers. But as I stared at the glowing bride across the crowded ballroom, a strange feeling washed over me. I narrowed my eyes and focused on her face. I looked past the expensive makeup, the perfect hair, and the designer jewelry. My brain, which was trained to recognize patterns and identify discrepancies, instantly snapped into focus. I did not feel a single ounce of heartbreak or jealousy. Instead, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to burst into hysterical laughter. I actually had to bite down hard on my lower lip to suppress the massive grin spreading across my face. I knew this woman. I knew her face very well. But her name was absolutely not Madison, and she definitely did not come from an old money family in Manhattan. Her real name was Amber. I knew this with absolute certainty because a highly classified federal dossier with her photograph printed on the very first page was currently sitting in a locked drawer at my desk back at the accounting firm. Amber was not a trust fund heiress. She was a high-level serial scammer. She was the primary target of an active federal financial fraud investigation that my team had been building for the past 6 months. Her entire operation consisted of creating fake aristocratic identities, infiltrating elite social circles, and targeting arrogant finance executives who thought they were too smart to be conned. She preyed on men exactly like Bradley, men whose massive egos and desire for a trophy wife blinded them to basic background checks. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was almost too brilliant to comprehend. Bradley, the man who had constantly belittled my intelligence and mocked my career in forensic accounting, had just legally bound himself to a master criminal. He thought he was marrying into endless wealth, but he had actually just handed the keys to his entire financial empire to a woman who drained bank accounts for a living. The cheap champagne in my hand suddenly tasted sweeter than the finest vintage. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that I simply could not hold in any longer. The sound of my amusement cut through the music and the chatter. Across the room, Bradley's head snapped in my direction. His smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, angry scowl. He handed his drink to a waiter and began marching straight across the ballroom floor, pushing past his wealthy guests with his eyes locked onto mine, eager to wipe that smile right off my face. He closed the distance between us in long, aggressive strides. Bradley always used his towering height to intimidate people in corporate boardrooms, and tonight he wore his bespoke Italian tuxedo like a weaponized suit of armor. He stopped mere inches from me, deliberately invading my personal space to establish a physical dominance he always craved. His jaw was rigidly clenched, and the sharp scent of an excessively expensive cologne, mixed with vintage bourbon, radiated off his skin. He demanded to know what I found so hilarious. He asked why the woman he had just legally discarded was grinning like an idiot at his luxury wedding reception. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cheap champagne and maintained unbroken, icy eye contact. I told him I was simply admiring his beautiful new bride standing under the spotlight. I said she seemed like a very unique and high-risk investment. Bradley sneered immediately, taking my comment as a bitter concession to his superior taste in women. He adjusted his silver silk tie and puffed out his chest, looking down at me with a gaze full of absolute contempt. He told me I was completely out of my depth in this environment. He said he mailed me the invitation tonight specifically so I could finally see what a real equal partnership looked like. He wanted me to stand in the corner and witness the exact level of elite luxury and high society influence I had utterly failed to provide during our marriage. Bradley then leaned in much closer, dropping his voice to a harsh, vicious whisper that only I could hear over the vibrant swell of the string quartet. He mocked my entire career trajectory with a deeply cruel edge to his voice. He asked me how my boring little forensic accounting job was going. He wondered aloud if spending 60 hours a week staring at financial anomalies in a beige cubicle was keeping me warm at night. He said I walked around pretending to be this brilliant financial investigator, but I had somehow missed the biggest fraudulent transaction of my own life. He leaned his face even closer until his breath was hot against my cheek. He confessed that he did not just beat me in the divorce settlement negotiations. He had completely humiliated me. He revealed that in the final chaotic weeks before our divorce decree became officially binding, he had quietly liquidated $3 million of our joint marital assets. He bragged about filtering the cash through a labyrinth of dummy corporations to establish a highly secure offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But the real twist, the ultimate insult he wanted to deliver to my face, was the specific name holding the keys to that account. He had put the entire $3 million under Madison's legal name. He gloated that he had successfully funneled my hard-earned money straight to his new girlfriend, right under my supposedly expert nose, leaving me with nothing to my name but the remaining equity in our shared suburban house. He truly thought he had completely destroyed my financial independence, and he wanted to watch my heart shatter in real time. He stepped back to admire his handiwork, waiting eagerly for the tears to fall. He fully expected me to scream, or cause a massive scene, or collapse in a pathetic puddle of despair right there by the ice sculpture. He went on to loudly praise his new bride to twist the knife further. He said Madison came from generationally guarded wealth and actually knew how to handle massive capital flow. He claimed she understood global markets naturally because she grew up surrounded by Manhattan billionaires. He called her an elite financial mind, wrapped in absolute aesthetic perfection. He said entrusting her with his offshore routing numbers was the absolute smartest business move he had ever executed. He stood there soaking in his own blinding arrogance, fully believing he had pulled off the perfect crime against his unglamorous ex-wife. I let the heavy silence stretch between us. I did not blink. I did not cry. I did not give him a single ounce of the emotional breakdown he was so desperately craving. My mind was already racing 10 steps ahead, processing the sheer magnitude of his monumental stupidity. He had just voluntarily handed $3 million of untraceable liquid cash to Amber, the exact federal target I was actively investigating for draining the bank accounts of gullible wealthy men. He had basically gift-wrapped his entire net worth and handed it directly to a professional financial predator. I offered him a bright, terrifyingly calm smile. I reached out and gently brushed a piece of imaginary lint off his tuxedo lapel. I told him I was genuinely impressed by his remarkably bold financial strategy. I kept my voice perfectly level and ruthlessly polite. I congratulated him on trusting a total stranger with his offshore routing protocols. I told him it takes a very special kind of reckless confidence to hand the keys to an untraceable financial empire to someone he had known for less than 6 months. Bradley frowned deeply, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He did not understand why I was not crying. He did not grasp the underlying threat layered within my polite words. Before his slow brain could formulate a response, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him standing utterly confused by the ice sculpture. I headed straight for the grand exit, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere of his fraudulent fairy tale and begin building my case. But before I could reach the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, my phone violently vibrated inside my clutch purse. It was a persistent, aggressive buzzing that signaled an absolute digital emergency. I pulled the device out and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was an automated critical security alert from the highest tier of my credit monitoring service. My blood ran ice cold as I read the notification. My personal social security number had just been successfully used as the primary guarantor for a newly approved $5 million commercial loan. The borrower listed on the immediate digital contract was a corporate shell company entirely controlled by Bradley. The air in my lungs vanished as the digital alert illuminated my screen. $5 million. The number stared back, mocking my false sense of security. Panic threatened to paralyze me on the polished marble floor. I knew if I stayed in the open, Bradley would see my shock and feed on it. I spun around and power walked away from the ice sculpture through the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. I pushed through the heavy gilded doors of the luxury ladies' lounge. The quiet elegance of the space offered a sharp contrast to the chaotic financial warfare exploding on my phone. I locked myself inside the largest stall and sank onto the velvet vanity stool. I completely bypassed the police and rapidly scrolled through my contacts until I found my absolute favorite person. I hit call on Deandra's name. She was my brother Connor's wife and the most ruthless corporate attorney in the entire state of Illinois. Deandra was a fierce, brilliant African-American woman who terrified opposing counsel simply by walking into a courtroom. She happened to be downstairs at this very reception, likely rolling her eyes at the mediocre catering. She answered on the second ring with a clipped professional greeting. I did not waste a single syllable on pleasantries. I told her to abandon her table immediately and get up to the second-floor restroom because Bradley had just crossed the line from a bitter ex-husband into an active federal felon. The phone line went dead. I knew she was already moving fast. 2 minutes later, the heavy restroom doors swung open with hurricane force. Deandra marched in wearing a striking emerald green evening gown that flowed around her like a superhero cape. Her stilettos clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing with absolute authority. She scanned the empty lounge, spotted my feet under the stall door, and commanded me to step out and show her the full damage. I stepped out and handed her my phone without saying a word. Deandra took the device, her dark eyes narrowing as she quickly processed the critical security alert. She read the notification detailing how my social security number had just been approved as the primary guarantor for a massive commercial loan under Bradley's newly formed shell company. Deandra's expression shifted from mild annoyance at the wedding reception to stone-cold predatory focus. She swiped through the banking app details, analyzing the digital footprint with the speed of a seasoned legal predator. She asked me how he bypassed the two-factor authentication. I explained that as my recent husband Bradley still had access to years of joint tax returns, digitized bank records, and high-level identification documents. He had enough raw data to forge my signature on commercial lending applications, especially if he used a shady broker in his vast network of corrupt investment bankers. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he timed the approval process perfectly with his wedding night distraction. We stood side by side in front of the vanity mirrors, piecing together the true magnitude of the operation. This was no longer just a petty divorce squabble over offshore routing numbers. Bradley and his fake bride Amber were orchestrating a massive synchronized identity theft operation. They were not merely hiding the $3 million in marital assets Bradley bragged about earlier. They were actively saddling me with a lethal $5 million debt. Deandra laid out the brutal reality of our situation. She explained that Bradley intended to cash out the loan funnel the liquid assets into Amber's untraceable offshore accounts and flee the country for his supposed honeymoon. He would disappear, leaving me holding the bag for a corporate loan I never authorized. Deandra paced the length of the restroom, outlining the legal severity of the impending disaster. She told me commercial loans of this magnitude move incredibly fast once the initial automated underwriting clears. If those funds were released to Bradley's shell company and wired overseas to the Cayman Islands, the bank would not care about our recent divorce decree. They would look at the forged guarantor signature on the loan origination documents and come straight after me. The bank would seize my business checking accounts, garnish my future wages, and place an aggressive lien on my house. My pristine credit score and professional reputation as a forensic accountant would be destroyed before Monday. Bradley was trying to financially assassinate me. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering, but my initial panic quickly morphed into a hyper-focused, calculating rage. I looked at Deandra and told her we were not going to let him get away with a single cent. She smiled fiercely and nodded, confirming that we were ready for war. We began strategizing our immediate legal counterattack. Deandra instructed me to pull up the specific routing numbers attached to the shell company while she drafted an emergency injunction on her phone to submit to the Federal Banking Commission. We needed to freeze the disbursement protocol before the bank processed the final wire transfer at the start of the next business day. Every single second mattered. We leaned over the marble sink, furiously cross-referencing the shell company's identification numbers with the federal fraud database I had access to. We were completely absorbed in building the digital barricade when a sudden, violent sound shattered the quiet sanctuary of the restroom. A loud, aggressive pounding hit the heavy oak door leading to the hallway. It was not the polite knock of a hotel staff member checking on guests. It was a heavy, demanding strike that rattled the gold hinges. Deandra and I froze, exchanging a sharp look of warning. I quickly shoved my phone into my clutch purse and took a careful step back. Before either of us could move toward the exit, the door was shoved open with brutal force. An imposing older man stepped directly into the threshold, completely blocking our only path back to the ballroom. He wore a perfectly fitted, custom-tailored tuxedo and carried a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. His face was deeply lined and flushed red with manufactured anger. I recognized him instantly from the main head table downstairs. It was the man playing the role of Madison's billionaire father. The actor from Amber's fraud ring had clearly been dispatched to deal with the ex-wife. He stood glaring at us with his incredibly broad shoulders filling the doorway, successfully trapping us inside the luxury restroom as our ticking clock continued to run out, leaving us cornered. The heavy oak door settled shut behind the imposing figure with a resounding click that echoed off the marble tiles. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, bringing with him the pungent scent of expensive cigars and cheap intimidation tactics. He looked the part of a Manhattan real estate baron flawlessly. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his posture screamed entitled arrogance. He took a sip of his whiskey and fixed his gaze directly on me, completely ignoring Deandra standing just a few feet away. He introduced himself as Arthur Madison's father. He spoke with a manufactured transatlantic accent that sounded like it had been lifted straight from a classic cinema movie. He told me he had been watching me skulk around the reception all evening like a bitter shadow. He said he noticed my little interaction with Bradley near the ice sculpture and decided it was time for a firm paternal intervention. Arthur took another step forward, attempting to use his physical size to box me into the vanity corner. He advised me to stop embarrassing myself. He said he understood that losing a man of Bradley's caliber to a woman of Madison's pedigree must be devastating for someone of my modest background. He waved his hand dismissively at my simple black dress. He claimed I was painfully out of my depth, mingling with high society. He suggested I was acting like a pathetic, jealous ex-wife, trying to ruin a beautiful union simply because I could not provide the lifestyle Bradley truly deserved. He leaned against the sink, crossing his arms, and aggressively warned me to pack up my little clutch purse and leave the premises immediately. He threatened that if I continued to harass the newlyweds, he would personally ensure the hotel security team dragged me out through the service elevator to save everyone the public humiliation. I stood absolutely perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not defend my dress or my background. I did not tell him that I owned a very successful forensic accounting career. I simply stared at his face, committing every single detail of his features to memory. My silence was not born of fear. It was born of sheer clinical calculation. I knew exactly who this man was, and it was definitely not Arthur the Manhattan real estate tycoon. I knew he was a hired gun, a seasoned grifter, recruited from Amber's meticulously organized fraud ring to play the protective billionaire patriarch. I let him keep talking. I let him dig a massive, unfillable hole with every threatening word that spilled from his mouth. I knew Deandra was standing right beside me, absorbing every single syllable, like a sponge soaking up highly actionable legal ammunition. Deandra finally moved. She took one elegant, powerful step forward, placing herself directly between the fake billionaire and me. The sharp click of her stiletto striking the marble sounded like a judge's gavel demanding absolute silence. Arthur paused, his manufactured accent faltering for a split second, as he finally registered the fierce corporate attorney standing in his path. Deandra did not yell. She did not raise her voice above a deadly conversational tone. She simply tilted her head and delivered a masterclass in legal intimidation. She began by reciting the exact state statutes for false imprisonment and aggravated harassment. She informed him that blocking the only exit to a hotel restroom while threatening physical removal by unauthorized personnel constituted an immediate actionable offense. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, holding it up to show him the active recording application that had been capturing his entire monologue. Arthur's face lost a significant amount of its ruddy color. Deandra did not give him a chance to recover. She seamlessly pivoted from criminal threats to corporate litigation. She told him she represented the legal interests of a premier forensic accounting firm. She stated that any attempt to intimidate their lead investigator while she was conducting an active digital audit would be classified as corporate espionage and obstruction of justice. She listed the federal penalties for those crimes with chilling precision. She demanded to know the name of his legal counsel and his primary holding company so she could draft the subpoenas before the reception even served the wedding cake. She promised to freeze his supposed real estate assets across the entire eastern seaboard by Monday morning. The actor's performance shattered completely. The aristocratic posture melted away, leaving behind a panicked, sweating man who realized he had just picked a fight with a legal predator. The transatlantic accent vanished entirely as he sputtered a frantic apology. He claimed he was just trying to look out for his daughter and meant no disrespect. Deandra took another step forward, invading his personal space. She instructed him to turn around, walk out the door, and reconsider his career choices before she decided to call the local authorities and have him arrested for impersonating a hotel guest. The man practically scrambled backward, stumbling over his own polished shoes in his haste to escape. He threw open the heavy oak door and bolted down the hallway without looking back. Deandra turned to me with a victorious smile, asking if we were ready to work. I nodded, feeling pure adrenaline. The distraction confirmed Amber's ring wanted me gone because they knew I could dismantle their operation. I pulled my phone and launched my firm's secure remote server, bypassing the commercial firewalls. I desperately needed to trace the exact collateral Bradley had utilized to secure the $5 million commercial loan. The sheer speed of the bank approval meant he had offered them a highly tangible asset. I navigated the digital ledger, isolating the loan origination documents attached to my stolen Social Security number. The screen quickly populated with encrypted banking codes. I scrolled to the collateral section, and my breath hitched. Bradley had cross-collateralized the physical deed to my own suburban house to back Madison's phantom crypto fund. I stared at the illuminated screen of my phone as the full, devastating scope of Bradley's financial trap crystallized before my eyes. The digital ledger did not lie. I navigated through the encrypted banking portal, tracing the origin of the $5 million commercial loan that was now tied directly to my Social Security number. Bradley had not just forged my signature on a random corporate application. He had aggressively leveraged the physical deed to our shared suburban house to back a phantom cryptocurrency fund managed entirely by his new bride. Because our divorce decree had not yet finalized the formal division of real estate assets, he had exploited a temporary legal loophole. He used his remaining access to our joint property records to cross-collateralize the estate. I showed the screen to Deandra, who leaned over my shoulder, her sharp legal mind immediately grasping the sheer mechanics of the fraud. We were standing in the quiet luxury of the hotel restroom, but the digital war had already begun. Deandra traced a manicured finger across the routing numbers flashing on my device. She laid out the brutal timeline we were facing. The initial automated underwriting for the commercial loan had been approved utilizing the fraudulent guarantor documents, but the actual international wire transfers were placed on a mandatory holding pattern until the next business day. We had exactly 48 hours. Once the clock struck 8 on Monday morning, the banking system would automatically process the massive disbursement directly into Amber's untraceable offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The absolute second that money crossed international borders, it would vanish into thin air. Amber would disappear, and the commercial bank would instantly recognize the loan as defaulted. Their automated recovery systems would trigger immediately. They would seize my home, seize my business checking accounts, and permanently garnish my professional wages for the rest of my natural life. Bradley had meticulously orchestrated a financial execution designed to leave me destitute. I locked my phone and slid it securely into my clutch purse. There was no time to panic, and there was absolutely no time to mourn the death of my previous life. I looked at Deandra and told her we needed to leave this toxic wedding reception right this very second. We bypassed the grand ballroom entirely, slipping down a carpeted side hallway and out through the hotel's revolving glass doors. The freezing Chicago night air hit my face, acting as a sharp, clarifying wake-up call. We stood on the curb waiting for the valet to retrieve Deandra's car while rapidly outlining our weekend battle plan. We needed to draft emergency injunctions, contact federal banking regulators, and establish a secure digital firewall around my remaining assets before the sun came up. But just as the valet pulled the car to the curb, Deandra's phone chimed with a high-priority alert from the county court filing system. She glanced at the screen and her jaw tightened. Bradley's legal team had just utilized an emergency weekend filing protocol to submit an expedited eviction notice for my house. He was not just trying to steal my financial future, he was actively trying to throw me onto the streets before Monday morning. Sunday morning broke with a heavy overcast sky, casting a gray light across my kitchen table. I had not slept a single minute. The dining table was completely buried under stacks of printed financial ledgers, highlighted bank statements, and open laptops, displaying complex routing algorithms. I was deep into a comprehensive forensic audit, tracing every single transaction Bradley had executed over the past 6 months. Deandra was in the adjacent home office drafting the federal injunctions we needed to block the Monday morning wire transfer. The house was quiet, filled only with the sound of my keyboard clicking and the hum of the refrigerator. That fragile peace shattered instantly when the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the front door lock echoed through the hallway. I stopped typing. I had changed the primary locks after the divorce, but Bradley had somehow retained an old emergency spare key to the mudroom entrance. The heavy wooden door swung open, hitting the wall with an aggressive thud. Footsteps marched loudly across the hardwood floor. Bradley and Beverly stormed into my kitchen uninvited and dripping with absolute entitlement. Beverly led the charge wearing a pristine cashmere coat and carrying a designer handbag like a weapon. Bradley stood closely behind her wearing casual designer weekend wear and sporting the most incredibly smug expression I had ever seen on a human face. He crossed his arms over his chest, completely relishing what he believed was his ultimate victory lap. Beverly did not waste a single second on basic pleasantries. She marched directly up to my kitchen table and violently slammed a thick stack of legal papers right over my carefully organized forensic spreadsheets. It was the emergency eviction notice. She looked down her nose at me with a gaze full of pure, haughty disgust. She demanded that I pack my belongings and vacate the premises immediately. She claimed the house no longer belonged to me and that her precious new daughter-in-law required the space. Beverly put a hand over her heart and manufactured a look of deep maternal concern. She proudly announced that Madison was newly pregnant. She insisted that the high society heiress was highly sensitive to stress and required the quiet comfort of this specific suburban estate for her delicate recovery and maternal peace. It was a completely fabricated narrative designed to make my forced removal seem like a moral necessity rather than a hostile takeover. Beverly reached into her designer handbag and dramatically pulled out a personal checkbook. She scribbled a number, tore the check free, and tossed it onto the table so it landed right next to the eviction notice. It was a check for $50,000. She offered it to me as a pathetic, insulting hush money payment. She told me to take the miserable payout walk away from the property without causing a scene and absolutely never contact her son again. She said $50,000 was more than generous for a woman of my low-tier background. Bradley chuckled softly from the doorway, clearly enjoying every single second of my perceived defeat. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to break down and beg for my home. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or reach for the pathetic check lying on my table. I simply kept my hands resting calmly on my laptop keyboard. With a slow, subtle movement of my left wrist, I activated the stealth recording application on my smartwatch. The tiny red indicator light blinked to life, capturing pristine audio of the entire confrontation. I leaned back in my chair and looked directly at Beverly. I told her I was fascinated by her desperate need to control Bradley's life. I asked her if protecting him from me was really worth orchestrating an illegal eviction. That simple, calculated push was all it took for Beverly's toxic nature to completely overflow. She took the bait instantly, unable to resist the opportunity to brag about her own manipulative brilliance. Her voice rose to a shrill, aggressive pitch as she began berating my entire existence. She proudly confessed that she had been pulling the strings behind our marriage for years. She accidentally revealed crucial action-based backstory right into my active recording device. Beverly boasted about the time she deliberately sabotaged my career networking events by intercepting my business invitations, ensuring I missed critical meetings that could have elevated my firm. She wanted me kept small and dependent so her son would always look superior. She did not stop there. High on her own arrogance, she openly admitted to manipulating Bradley into draining our joint marital savings accounts long before the divorce was even finalized. She proudly stated she was the one who instructed him to funnel that cash into his solo offshore investments, protecting his wealth from a career-obsessed gold digger like me. She praised herself for saving her son from my financial clutches, completely unaware she was actively confessing to premeditated asset hiding and financial manipulation on a recorded line. I sat there quietly absorbing every single ounce of her verbal abuse, ensuring the smartwatch captured every crystal-clear admission of their financial crimes. Bradley finally grew impatient with his mother's grandstanding. He stepped forward, his smug demeanor hardening into an aggressive threat. He slammed his hand flat against the eviction papers on the table. He demanded that I pick up a pen and sign the legal surrender of the property right that very second. He leaned his tall frame over me, trying to use his physical presence to force my compliance. He warned me that if I refused to sign, he would immediately call the local police department and have me forcibly removed from the property for trespassing. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, holding it up as a direct threat, ready to dial emergency services and subject me to the ultimate neighborhood humiliation. I just smiled softly as the door to the home office slowly clicked open and Deandra stepped out into the kitchen holding a very different stack of legal documents. Deandra glided into the kitchen with the lethal grace of a predator who had just cornered her prey. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson blazer that commanded immediate respect, and her expression was absolutely merciless. She did not raise her voice or rush her movements. She simply walked up to the kitchen table and placed her thick stack of premium legal bond paper directly on top of Beverly's pathetic eviction notice. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the wood echoed like a final verdict in the tense silence of the room. Bradley's smug smile vanished instantly. He lowered his cell phone, his thumb freezing right above the emergency dial button. He knew exactly who Deandra was. He had sat across from her during our early divorce mediation sessions, and he was intimately aware that she never lost a corporate negotiation. Beverly, however, completely missed the drastic shift in the power dynamic. She huffed in profound annoyance, crossing her arms tighter over her cashmere coat, and demanded to know who this woman was and why she was interrupting a private family matter. Deandra completely ignored Beverly entirely. She locked her dark, piercing eyes onto Bradley and informed him that his emergency eviction filing was not just legally void, but completely laughable. She calmly explained that an eviction requires the petitioner to actually possess legal authority over the property in question. Bradley scoffed loudly, regaining a fraction of his false bravado. He aggressively tapped his finger against the paper he had brought, claiming his name was still on the original mortgage, and the final asset division was not yet signed by the judge. He insisted he had every legal right to force me out of the residence, to make room for his newly pregnant wife. That was the exact moment Deandra sprang the trap. She picked up her stack of documents and slid the top page toward him. She suggested he read the newly filed county records. She revealed that, anticipating his exact brand of financial treachery, due to my extensive background in forensic accounting, I had not been sitting idle during our separation. Exactly 14 days prior, I had legally transferred my entire equity share and the physical deed of the property into a highly secure, independent, and irrevocable trust. I had named Deandra's law firm as the primary executor. I no longer legally owned the suburban house as an individual entity. The trust owned it completely, and the trust had absolutely no intention of evicting its sole beneficiary. Bradley stared at the paperwork, his eyes darting frantically across the certified county stamps and the ironclad legal jargon. The color rapidly drained from his arrogant face as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His fabricated eviction notice was nothing more than worthless scrap paper. Beverly snatched the document from her son's trembling hands, attempting to read the legal text she clearly did not comprehend. She shrieked loudly that this was highly illegal and accused us of stealing her son's rightful property. Deandra finally turned her chilling gaze toward my former mother-in-law. She advised Beverly to lower her voice before she added a noise complaint to the list of offenses occurring in my kitchen. Deandra then delivered the second devastating blow. She leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the surface, and brought her face inches from Bradley's. She told him that the failed eviction was actually the absolute least of his current problems. She systematically laid out the catastrophic legal peril he had just voluntarily walked into. She brought up the $5 million commercial loan he had aggressively fast-tracked through his shady broker network the night before. She detailed how his application heavily relied on cross-collateralizing the physical deed to this exact suburban house to back Madison's phantom cryptocurrency portfolio. Bradley's breath hitched audibly. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. Deandra's voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper that cut through his rising panic. She explained that because the house had been securely locked inside an irrevocable trust for 2 solid weeks before he signed those commercial loan documents, he had essentially attempted to leverage a massive corporate asset he no longer possessed. I watched from my chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed, as Deandra delivered the fatal classification. She informed him that lying about collateral on a multi-million-dollar commercial bank loan application carried a very specific and highly unforgiving legal definition. It was federal mortgage fraud. By signing those electronic documents last night under the belief he still held equity in this house, he had committed a massive felony. The commercial bank would immediately flag the discrepancy the second their automated underwriting system attempted to verify the deed on Monday morning. When they discovered the property was shielded by a corporate trust, they would instantly default the loan and trigger a massive federal investigation directly targeting his personal credentials. The arrogant, invincible investment banker who had stormed into my house minutes earlier was entirely gone. Bradley looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. His broad shoulders sagged and sweat began to bead along his hairline. He looked frantically at his mother, who was still aggressively ranting about high society rights, and Madison's delicate pregnancy, completely oblivious to the fact that her son was now facing severe federal prison time. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, failing him completely. He knew the banking industry inside and out. He knew Deandra was not bluffing. He knew the automated security protocols at the commercial bank would shred his professional reputation the absolute second the business day began. He was trapped in a financial nightmare of his own making. The sheer terror radiating from him was palpable. If the loan defaulted, before it even dispersed, his entire liquidity strategy would collapse. He desperately needed the $5 million to bridge the gap in his massive offshore transfer. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He realized his physical collateral had completely vanished, and his entire financial future now hinged on the untraceable cash he had already funneled overseas. He needed to ensure the $3 million in stolen marital assets were securely locked down in the Cayman Islands account before the commercial loan implosion triggered an international asset freeze. His survival depended entirely on the woman he thought was his perfect high society bride. He wildly shoved his hand into his designer pocket and ripped his phone out. His fingers trembled violently as he unlocked the glowing digital screen and frantically swiped through his extensive business contacts to call Madison and secure the offshore funds immediately. Bradley's thumb aggressively hit the screen of his phone, tapping his new wife's contact icon with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation. He pressed the device hard against his ear, his breathing ragged and uneven. The line rang once, twice. Then the automated carrier message kicked in, sending him straight to a sterile generic voicemail box. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, panicked sound, and immediately hit redial. He paced the length of my kitchen, his designer sneakers squeaking harshly against the polished hardwood floor. Again, the call went straight to voicemail. He pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the blank digital screen as if the device itself had physically betrayed him. He tried a third time, his fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped the expensive phone onto the granite counter. Nothing but the digital void offered a response. Beverly, sensing the sudden volatile shift in the atmosphere but completely failing to comprehend the catastrophic legal disaster unfolding around her, stepped toward her son. She reached out to pat his arm, offering a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured tone of comfort. She insisted he needed to calm down and stop pacing like a caged animal. She told him Madison was likely just resting at the exclusive luxury spa appointment she had booked for the morning. Beverly waved her hand dismissively, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together. She claimed that high society women needed their beauty rest, especially considering her delicate, newly pregnant state. She assured Bradley that his perfect bride had probably just turned her phone off to avoid any unnecessary stress from the outside world. She glared directly at me as she said it, clearly implying I was the sole source of that toxic stress. But Bradley could not be soothed by his mother's oblivious delusions. The pristine facade of the confident, untouchable investment banker had completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He knew that the $3 million in stolen marital assets were currently floating in a highly vulnerable digital space, waiting to be anchored firmly into the offshore account. Without his physical collateral, the upcoming commercial loan default would trigger a massive, unavoidable asset freeze across all his domestic portfolios. He desperately needed Madison to execute the final routing authorization immediately. He violently shoved his mother's comforting hand away, a gesture of pure, unfiltered panic that made Beverly gasp in shock. He spun around to face me, his features contorted with a dangerous mix of sheer terror and wildly misplaced rage. Since he could not reach his fake heiress, he directed all of his explosive anger directly at the only available target in the room. He pointed a shaking finger at me and launched into a desperate, vicious tirade. He accused me of orchestrating this entire legal nightmare out of sheer, pathetic jealousy. He screamed that I was so deeply envious of Madison's effortless beauty, her flawless pedigree, and her massive generational wealth that I had spent the last 2 weeks plotting to destroy his newfound happiness. He claimed my brilliant decision to transfer the house into an irrevocable trust was nothing but a bitter, spiteful move from an aging, unglamorous ex-wife who could not stand to see him move on to a significantly better life. He yelled that I was a vindictive, cold-hearted machine who wanted to ruin his financial empire simply because I was incapable of securing a man of his elite caliber. He paced wildly, his chest heaving, throwing every insult he had ever hurled at me during our marriage, but this time amplified by his raw, absolute desperation. I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table. I did not flinch at his elevated volume. I did not defend myself against his ridiculous accusations of jealousy. I certainly did not point out the hilarious irony of him calling me cold-hearted while he actively tried to leave me with $5 million in fraudulent debt. I maintained an icy, unbroken composure, watching him unravel piece by piece right in my own home. Deandra stood faithfully beside me, radiating silent, lethal authority, her arms crossed firmly over her crimson blazer. We let him scream. We let him exhaust his adrenaline, knowing that his panic was entirely self-inflicted. His spectacular meltdown was the inevitable result of his own blinding arrogance meeting a solid wall of legal accountability. I waited patiently until he finally ran out of breath. He stood panting in the center of the kitchen, his face flushed dark red, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands flat on the table. I told him his unwavering devotion to his new wife was truly touching to witness. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of emotion to deliver maximum impact. I told him I sincerely hoped she was enjoying that luxury spa appointment, but I highly doubted she was currently anywhere near the greater Chicago area. I casually mentioned that she was probably quite busy managing her highly complex international portfolio. Bradley scoffed, attempting to project a hollow confidence, telling me I knew absolutely nothing about Madison's vast wealth. I smiled, a tight, highly calculated expression that made his bravado falter. I told him he was absolutely right. I said I knew very little about Madison the socialite, but I was becoming incredibly familiar with a highly specific, obscure financial shell company based entirely out of the Cayman Islands. I clearly and deliberately enunciated the exact legal name of the offshore holding corporation Amber used to launder her stolen funds. Bradley froze instantly. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. That specific corporate name was the most tightly guarded secret of his entire financial rooting strategy. It was the exact holding company Madison had given him to secure the $3 million. There was absolutely no public record connecting him to that entity, and no legitimate reason for a domestic forensic accountant to possess that heavily guarded information. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of exactly how much I truly knew. Bradley finally found his voice, but it emerged as a hoarse and frantic demand. He lunged a half-step forward before Deandra shifted her weight to intercept him, causing him to freeze in his tracks. He demanded to know how I possessed the name of that specific Cayman Islands holding company. He accused me of illegally hacking his personal servers or hiring private investigators to stalk his new wife. He was grasping at every possible conspiracy theory, trying to rationalize the gaping hole in his impenetrable financial armor. He insisted the corporate entity was completely shielded by international privacy laws and layered behind multiple blind trusts. He shouted that a mid-level accountant working out of a basic Chicago office could never organically uncover a proprietary wealth management structure unless she had committed a federal cybercrime. I maintained my relaxed posture at the kitchen table and let a small patronizing sigh escape my lips. I corrected his wild assumptions with the cold, hard precision of my profession. I explained that I did not need to hack anything or break a single law to follow his incredibly sloppy digital trail. I told him that forensic accounting is not magic, but rather the meticulous observation of human behavior reflected in financial data. I explained that when someone claims to possess massive generational wealth, they leave a very distinct historical footprint. Real old money is anchored by decades of philanthropic board memberships, legacy estate taxes, and long-standing institutional trust structures holding physical properties. I stared directly into his panicked eyes and delivered the fatal diagnosis. I told him his pristine new bride did not possess a single marker of a legacy heiress. Her financial footprint was entirely that of a corporate ghost. Every single corporate entity tied to Madison had been incorporated within the last 8 months. There was zero historical legacy, zero verified family wealth, and an alarming amount of rapid capital movement across shifting digital borders. She was a financial phantom, operating exclusively through shell companies designed to evaporate at a moment's notice. Beverly gasped loudly, clutching her designer handbag as if I had just physically assaulted her. She stepped fiercely in front of her son, attempting to shield him from my devastating analysis. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger at me and demanded I stop speaking such horrific lies about her new daughter-in-law. She shrieked that my jealousy had finally driven me completely insane. Beverly insisted that Madison came from a world so incredibly exclusive and sophisticated that a common suburban worker like myself could never possibly comprehend their asset protection strategies. She claimed Madison's family simply valued ultimate privacy and utilized modern wealth management tools that outdated accountants failed to understand. She turned her vitriol entirely onto my career, claiming my entire professional life was nothing but a desperate attempt to feel important while tearing down genuinely successful people. She grabbed Bradley's arm and shook it slightly, demanding he ignore my bitter, unhinged fabrications. She told him I was just a desperate, lonely woman trying to poison his mind and ruin his beautiful honeymoon out of pure spite, because I knew I would never find another man of his status. Bradley desperately needed to believe his mother. The alternative meant facing the absolute destruction of his entire existence and acknowledging that his monumental ego had led him straight into a catastrophic trap. He drew in a jagged breath and forced his shoulders back desperately, trying to reconstruct his shattered, arrogant facade. He smoothed the front of his designer shirt and manufactured a tight, strained smirk that did not reach his terrified eyes. He declared that his money was perfectly safe and completely untouchable. He claimed his offshore routing protocols utilized military-grade encryption and required complex multi-signature authentication that only he controlled. He insisted Madison was the most trustworthy, brilliant woman he had ever met, and that she was currently managing his capital with flawless precision while he dealt with his hysterical ex-wife. He tried to laugh, but the sound emerged brittle and hollow, echoing off the kitchen walls. He proudly announced that I was completely powerless to stop his financial ascension and that he was leaving this pathetic house to join his wealthy bride and celebrate his ultimate victory over me. He turned his back to me, signaling he was finished entertaining my supposed jealousy. I stood up from the kitchen table, pushing my chair back with a deliberate scrape against the hardwood floor. I told them both that this uninvited visit was officially over. Deandra took a step toward the hallway, gesturing toward the front door with absolute finality. She reminded them that any further refusal to vacate the premises would result in an immediate police escort and a subsequent restraining order for criminal trespassing. Beverly huffed indignantly, adjusting her cashmere coat and muttering under her breath about how I would die miserable and alone in this empty house. Bradley grabbed the brass doorknob, trying to project an air of triumphant departure. He threw one last hateful glare over his shoulder, promising I would regret trying to cross him and threatening a massive defamation lawsuit the moment he returned from his trip. I walked slowly toward the entryway, stopping just a few feet away from his retreating figure. I looked at him with an expression of profound clinical pity. I offered him one final piece of free professional advice before he walked out of my life forever. I told him to log into his highly encrypted banking application and carefully review the primary signature authorizations on his offshore accounts before he boarded his luxury flight to the Maldives the next morning. I suggested he make absolutely certain he was still the sole designated signatory holding the keys to his rapidly vanishing kingdom. I gently closed the heavy wooden door, right in his horrified face, locking the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. Locking out the chaos Bradley and Beverly had brought to my doorstep. The silence that fell over my suburban house was absolute, providing a stark contrast to the aggressive screaming match that had just taken place in my kitchen. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the front door for a fraction of a second, taking a single deep breath to steady the massive surge of adrenaline currently flooding my veins. Deandra was already moving with the fierce efficiency of a seasoned general preparing for an unavoidable war. She pulled out her encrypted phone and dialed my brother Connor, instructing him to drop whatever weekend project he was doing and get to my house immediately. I walked back into the kitchen, clearing away the last remnants of Beverly's ridiculous eviction notice and rapidly wiping down the granite countertops to make ample room for the impending digital warfare. Connor arrived less than 20 minutes later, his tires screeching slightly in the driveway. He practically kicked the front door open, carrying two massive tactical Pelican cases filled with high-grade networking hardware and encrypted server banks. As an IT director for a major national logistics firm, Connor knew exactly how to establish a secure, untraceable digital command center in a matter of minutes. He did not ask unnecessary questions about the domestic dispute or the state of my kitchen. He simply hugged me tight, kissed his wife, and started pulling thick black cables and high-resolution monitors from his protective cases. We swiftly transformed my quiet dining room into a highly classified forensic auditing environment. Connor bypassed my standard residential internet provider, entirely setting up a dedicated encrypted satellite uplink in the backyard using a portable dish. He knew we were dealing with a sophisticated international fraud syndicate and a desperate, well-connected investment banker. So local network security was nowhere near sufficient for the sensitive data we were about to intercept. I booted up my primary workstation and authenticated my federal clearance credentials, utilizing a biometric scanner and a rotating security token to ensure absolute anonymity. As a forensic accountant actively consulting for federal financial task forces, my specific clearance levels allowed me to view banking architecture that civilian platforms and local law enforcement simply could not reach. I brought up the active digital dossier I had been meticulously building on Amber for the past 6 months. The large monitor illuminated the room with a dizzying array of wire transfer logs, false corporate identities, and red-flagged international routing numbers. Deandra stood directly behind me, analyzing the rapid data streams and mapping out the aggressive legal framework we needed to execute before Monday morning. Our goal was not to stop Bradley from losing his money. He had stolen those funds and made his own choices out of pure arrogance. Our ultimate goal was to ensure the federal government caught him holding the smoking gun when Amber finally detonated the explosive charges on his offshore accounts. I began linking Bradley's recently established shell companies directly to Amber's known historical routing patterns. I systematically overlaid the complex data points matching the precise timestamps of Bradley's $3 million offshore transfer against the exact digital pathways Amber had utilized in her previous high-profile corporate scams. The forensic correlation was an absolute 100% match, leaving zero room for doubt. She was using a highly customized routing algorithm that funneled stolen capital through a series of temporary holding accounts in Cyprus before depositing the final laundered sum into the Cayman Islands. I isolated the specific transaction hashes and began compiling the raw, unedited data required for a suspicious activity report. A standard SAR normally takes traditional banking institutions weeks to process, review, and escalate to federal authorities due to immense bureaucratic red tape and slow compliance departments. We did not have weeks. We had less than 24 hours before the money evaporated completely into the digital ether. Deandra took a seat next to me, cracking her knuckles with predatory anticipation. She brought her formidable corporate law expertise to the table, instructing Connor on exactly how to embed the necessary legal injunctions directly into the digital reporting architecture of the SAR. She ensured the federal report was hard-coded with highly specific federal trigger warnings designed to bypass all local banking delays entirely. Deandra structured the legal metadata so meticulously that the absolute second Bradley attempted to authorize his final international transfer on Monday morning, the report would flag as a Priority 1 national security threat. This hard-coded trigger would transmit the alert directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Division, completely bypassing the commercial bank's standard slow review process. We were essentially turning Bradley's own financial authorizations into a highly visible federal flare gun that would illuminate his crimes for the entire United States government to see. Connor integrated Deandra's legal coding into the primary reporting packet, testing the outbound connections to ensure the firewall penetration would hold firm. The digital pipeline was completely established, linking Bradley's compromised accounts to a direct feed straight to the federal authorities. We had successfully armed the trap and handed the detonator directly to Bradley, ensuring that his next financial move would seal his absolute downfall. The afternoon stretched into the freezing winter evening as our dedicated team spent the next several hours meticulously mapping out every single one of Amber's previous victims. I projected the historical fraud data onto a massive secondary monitor Connor had temporarily mounted to the dining room wall, transforming my home into a legitimate federal tracking station. We intensely analyzed the financial wreckage Amber had left in her wake over the past 3 years, tracking the destroyed lives and shattered reputations of men who believed they were untouchable. I overlaid her historical scam patterns directly on top of Bradley's current financial actions, creating a vivid chronological map of his catastrophic stupidity. Through the raw transaction logs and communication timestamps, a glaring story of pure hubris emerged, painting a picture of exactly how Bradley had orchestrated his own demise. Bradley had been the absolute perfect mark for a predator of Amber's caliber. She intentionally targeted arrogant high-net-worth individuals who possessed massive egos and deep-seated professional insecurities. Men who firmly believed they were the smartest people in any given room and routinely refused to listen to professional financial advisors. I pulled up the initial banking approval logs Bradley had confidently submitted for his newly established offshore accounts. The raw data showed exactly how he had aggressively bypassed standard banking protocols and deliberately ignored basic corporate due diligence requirements. He pushed the lucrative applications through his shady network of corrupt investment banking connections, forcing the critical paperwork through without proper background checks, simply because he was completely blinded by Amber's fabricated high society pedigree. She had played the role of the subservient wealthy heiress, flawlessly feeding his insatiable need for dominance while quietly acquiring every single piece of his personal financial data, his passwords, and his corporate authorization tokens. I dug much deeper into the specific mechanisms of the ongoing fraud, separating the layers of digital deception to uncover the core architecture of the scam. I needed to understand exactly how Amber planned to execute the final devastating maneuver without getting caught in the federal crossfire. I traced the digital tethers connecting the $3 million offshore account directly to the fraudulent $5 million commercial loan. The dark brilliance of her scam was entirely rooted in Bradley's overwhelming greed and his absolute desire to hide his assets from me. She had successfully convinced him to secure the massive commercial loan using his personal identification and the false collateral of my house, promising to match the dispersed funds with her phantom cryptocurrency portfolio. But the offshore account holding the $3 million of stolen marital assets was structured with a highly malicious delayed unilateral withdrawal clause. I highlighted the specific line of malicious code buried deep within the Cayman Islands banking portal, bringing it to the center of the main monitor for Deandra and Connor to examine. Amber had engineered the entire financial system so that she could completely drain the offshore account just moments before the commercial loan funds officially dispersed. She would take his untraceable liquid cash and vanish into the international wind, leaving the $5 million debt permanently anchored to Bradley's verified personal identity. She was essentially using him as a financial human shield, ensuring that when the federal authorities inevitably came looking for the missing commercial loan funds, Bradley would be the only person left holding the fraudulent documents. Connor leaned much closer to his main monitor, his fingers flying across his illuminated mechanical keyboard with blistering speed. He had been running a deep diagnostic penetration scan on the automated execution protocols within Bradley's compromised financial accounts, searching for any delayed triggers. He abruptly stopped typing and pointed to a hidden string of heavily encrypted commands buried within the commercial bank's pending transaction queue. Connor discovered a pending automated execution script carefully programmed by Amber to launch at the exact start of the impending financial business day. She had meticulously scheduled the total asset wipeout to initiate precisely at 8 in the morning on Monday. I quickly checked the comprehensive flight itineraries Deandra had pulled during our earlier legal reconnaissance sweeps, cross-referencing the time zones and departure schedules. 8 in the morning was the precise moment Bradley was scheduled to be standing in the international terminal at the airport, checking his bags, and preparing to board his luxury honeymoon flight to the Maldives. He would be entirely cut off from his secure desktop connections, completely reliant on his mobile banking application, and entirely distracted by the airport security process while Amber dismantled his entire life and effectively burned his financial empire to the ground. Sunday night descended upon the sprawling Chicago suburbs, bringing a freezing torrential rain that aggressively battered against the large bay windows of my house. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, turning the streets to ice, but inside the dining room, the atmosphere was electric with intense, highly focused energy. Only 12 hours remained before the international banking systems opened. The automated funds would vanish forever, and the digital trap would finally snap shut. We were completely exhausted, running on black coffee and pure, unfiltered adrenaline, but nobody dared to step away from the glowing monitors. Suddenly, Deandra's sleek professional laptop chimed with an urgent high-priority notification from the county electronic judicial filing system, breaking the steady silence of the room. Bradley, furious from the humiliating morning confrontation and desperately trying to regain a microscopic sliver of control over his unraveling life, had just attempted a petty retaliatory legal strike. Unable to access his offshore funds or force me out of the suburban house, he directed his aggressive corporate legal team to file an emergency motion to completely freeze my legitimate business checking accounts. He submitted a highly fraudulent claim to the weekend duty judge, stating those specific corporate accounts contained disputed marital assets and required an immediate judicial hold pending a comprehensive divorce decree review. It was a desperate, spiteful distraction designed entirely to cripple my forensic accounting firm and punish me for daring to defy his authority earlier that day. Deandra did not even blink at the incoming threat or the absurd late-night filing. She cracked a fierce, predatory smile and immediately went into absolute legal combat mode, treating the electronic motion as a direct insult to her professional capabilities. She intercepted the electronic motion the exact second it hit the county docket, preventing it from reaching a judge's desk unopposed. With blinding speed and unparalleled legal precision, she drafted a blistering counter-motion, explicitly citing the finalized divorce decree that clearly and undeniably delineated my business accounts as protected premarital assets, completely immune to his post-divorce financial tampering. She did not stop there, utilizing the full arsenal of evidence we had collected during the morning ambush. She seamlessly attached the pristine audio recording I had captured on my smartwatch earlier that day. She submitted the digital audio file directly into the public court record, providing irrefutable, devastating proof of Bradley and Beverly actively admitting to premeditated asset-hiding, malicious financial manipulation, and attempting to execute an illegal eviction. Deandra hit the submit key with a satisfying flourish, effectively neutralizing his pathetic legal attack, while simultaneously cementing a permanent public record of his financial crimes for the presiding judge to review the moment the courthouse opened on Monday morning. Bradley's spiteful distraction was completely dismantled in less than 20 minutes, resulting only in him wasting his own precious time and accumulating thousands of dollars in useless legal billing hours while he remained entirely blind to the massive federal disaster hurtling toward him at terminal velocity. He was so focused on trying to inflict minor damages on my legitimate business that he entirely ignored the glaring vulnerabilities in his own offshore infrastructure. The clock ticked steadily past midnight, echoing softly in the quiet house. The three of us sat in total silence, watching the raw green data streams cascade across our high-definition screens, illuminating the dark room with a spectral light. Everything was securely in place. The hard-coded federal alerts were fully primed and ready to deploy at the slightest provocation. My personal assets and business accounts were heavily locked behind impenetrable legal and digital firewalls that Bradley could never breach. The only thing left to do was sit back and wait for Bradley to walk blindly into his own execution chamber. I stared intently at my phone, watching the digital clock slowly inch closer to the morning hours. Just before the break of dawn, my screen illuminated with a final automated ping from the airline tracking software Connor had covertly integrated into our monitoring system. A boarding pass barcode had just been successfully scanned at the first-class designated counter of the international airport. Bradley had officially checked into his luxury flight to the Maldives for his supposed fairy tale honeymoon. He was likely standing in the exclusive airport lounge, sipping expensive vintage champagne, feeling like the absolute king of the world, completely and utterly oblivious to the impending financial slaughter waiting for him at exactly 8 in the morning. The sun broke over the freezing Chicago skyline, casting a pale gray light across my dining room. My command center was fully operational. The monitors hummed with steady streams of data connecting Bradley's compromised accounts to the federal reporting pipeline Deandra and Connor had constructed. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name. I drew a slow, measured breath, tapped the screen to accept the call, and activated the recording software. I placed the phone on the center of the table, engaging the speaker function so Deandra and Connor could hear every single word. Bradley's voice boomed through the quiet room, dripping with an unbearable level of arrogant satisfaction. He did not say hello. He immediately launched into a boastful monologue broadcasting his location with absolute pride. He proudly announced he was calling from the exclusive first-class VIP lounge at O'Hare International Airport. He painted a vivid picture of his surroundings, describing the plush leather armchair he was sitting in and the vintage champagne he was currently sipping while waiting for his boarding group to be called. He wanted to make sure I knew exactly how luxurious his morning was compared to mine. He mocked the freezing winter weather outside my suburban window, telling me how much he was looking forward to the tropical sunshine of the Maldives. He said the ocean water was perfectly clear, and the private overwater bungalow he had booked was the ultimate symbol of his massive success. Bradley was completely intoxicated by his own perceived victory. He spent the next several minutes gloating about how he had outsmarted me at every single turn. He brought up our divorce, claiming he had orchestrated the entire settlement to leave me stranded in a dead-end life. He laughed about the failed eviction notice from the day before, dismissing it as a minor legal technicality that barely slowed his momentum. He insisted that my little trust fund trick with the house was nothing but a pathetic, desperate attempt to maintain relevance in a financial world I simply could not understand. He wanted me to know that my forensic accounting spreadsheets and my long hours in the office were entirely worthless compared to his sheer executive brilliance. He told me I was destined to spend the rest of my life auditing mediocre tax returns, while he traveled the globe expanding his wealth alongside a woman who actually matched his elite status. I sat in absolute silence, letting his massive ego inflate to its maximum capacity. I did not interrupt his cruel tirade. I did not defend my career or my life choices. I simply watched the digital clock on my monitor inch closer and closer to 8 in the morning. My eyes tracked the active GPS ping from his cellular device, confirming he was indeed sitting exactly where he claimed to be, right in the heart of the international terminal. His voice echoed through my kitchen, thick with a profound toxic arrogance. He truly believed he had committed the perfect financial crime against his unglamorous ex-wife, and he wanted to revel in my supposed despair. He took another audible sip of his champagne and asked me if I had anything to say before he boarded his flight and blocked my number permanently. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. My voice was perfectly calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the emotional breakdown he was so desperately craving. I asked him a very simple, highly specific question. I asked Bradley if Madison was sitting right next to him at that exact moment. Bradley let out a sharp, mocking scoff that vibrated through the phone speaker. He found my question incredibly pathetic, entirely misinterpreting my cold precision for lingering bitter jealousy. He confidently stated that his gorgeous new bride was not currently sitting beside him. He explained with a casual, dismissive wave of his hand that Madison had just stepped away to grab them some premium artisan coffee from a high-end cafe located further down the terminal concourse. He took this opportunity to praise her yet again, highlighting her refined tastes and her independent high society nature. He claimed she refused to drink the complimentary lounge coffee because she only consumed a specific imported blend, and he found her expensive demands absolutely charming. He painted this vivid romantic picture of his perfect wife strolling through the luxury shops, while he handled the unpleasant business of dismissing his ex-wife one final time. He told me to stop obsessing over Madison and accept the fact that I had been completely replaced by a superior woman. Deandra caught my eye from across the kitchen island and offered a razor-sharp grin. That was the exact moment I dropped all remaining traces of polite conversation. The temperature in my voice plummeted, turning instantly lethal and absolute. I informed Bradley with surgical precision that Madison was absolutely not standing in line for artisan coffee. I told him she was not browsing the luxury duty-free boutiques, and she was definitely not walking back to the VIP lounge to join him on a romantic flight to the Maldives. I stated clearly and forcefully that the woman he married was currently located in an entirely different terminal on the opposite side of the airport. I pulled up the secondary flight manifesto Connor had covertly bypassed earlier that morning. I read the exact details aloud to Bradley. I told him that his beloved bride had already passed through a different security checkpoint and was actively boarding a separate international flight destined for a remote country that held absolutely no extradition treaties with the United States. I gave him the flight number, the departure gate, and the exact timestamp she had scanned her boarding pass. Bradley went completely silent for 2 heavy, agonizing seconds. Then he erupted into a harsh, defensive laughter. He vehemently refused to believe a single word I was saying. He called me deeply delusional, completely unhinged, and pathetically desperate. He insisted I was fabricating this entire ridiculous story out of pure spite to ruin his final moments in Chicago. He aggressively stated that Madison's designer carry-on luggage was sitting right next to his leather armchair, proving she intended to return immediately. I did not raise my voice, but I hit him with a heavy dose of forensic reality. I calmly pointed out that the designer bag sitting next to him was likely filled with old magazines, hotel towels, or heavy rocks designed specifically to create a false sense of security while she executed her escape. Bradley began to genuinely lose his temper. His voice cracked with rising panic and aggressive denial. He demanded I stop playing these psychotic mind games. He shouted that I was a bitter, lonely woman trying to poison his reality. He threatened to end the call and summon hotel security to report me for stalking. I did not argue with his frantic denials. I did not try to convince him with more flight data. I simply instructed him to stop yelling at me and look up. I told him to direct his eyes away from his phone, away from the fake decoy luggage, and look directly at the prominent flat-screen televisions mounted across the walls of the luxury first-class lounge. Through the open phone line, I could hear the ambient background noise of the airport lounge shifting. Bradley's heavy breathing paused as he reluctantly followed my instruction. He looked up at the massive monitors that were previously displaying generic morning talk shows and financial market updates. Suddenly, the standard programming was aggressively interrupted by a piercing emergency broadcast tone. A breaking news alert flashed across every single screen in the lounge, casting a stark red and white glow over the wealthy passengers. The news anchor's voice echoed simultaneously across the room, announcing a massive nationwide federal manhunt spearheaded by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. Then the image appeared. A high-resolution, unedited photograph filled the screens. It was the face of his beautiful high society bride, the woman he had legally married just days ago. But the bold, scrolling chyron beneath her face did not read Madison. It displayed her true legal identity in massive block letters, warning the public about a highly dangerous individual named Amber. The broadcast detailed the exact nature of her massive serial fraud operation. The anchor explained how this specific criminal organization methodically targeted arrogant, wealthy finance executives. The news report outlined her entire playbook, explaining how she created fabricated aristocratic identities, infiltrated elite corporate social circles, and established fake romantic relationships. The anchor explicitly detailed how she convinced these arrogant men to drain their own marital assets into offshore accounts before saddling them with catastrophic fraudulent corporate debt and vanishing into the international wind. Every single word the news anchor spoke perfectly mirrored the exact timeline of Bradley's rapid romance and catastrophic financial decisions. I heard a sharp physical intake of breath through the phone, followed immediately by the unmistakable violent sound of shattering crystal. The heavy champagne flute had completely slipped from Bradley's paralyzed fingers, crashing against the polished tile floor of the lounge and exploding into hundreds of jagged pieces. The sharp noise caused a commotion as nearby passengers turned to stare at the source of the disruption. Bradley was in a state of absolute catatonic shock. He dropped the phone from his ear but left the active speaker connection engaged, allowing me to hear his frantic, panicked movements. He began spinning around wildly, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the floor as he desperately searched the faces of the crowds passing by the lounge entrance. He was frantically looking for Madison, hoping against hope that she would suddenly appear with 2 cups of artisan coffee to prove the television broadcast was some kind of elaborate prank. But the crowd offered nothing but strangers. She was truly, completely gone, just as I had warned him. The public humiliation began to set in instantly. The other wealthy passengers in the VIP lounge were actively watching the news broadcast and then turning their heads to stare directly at Bradley. Several of his corporate peers who had attended his lavish wedding reception just days prior were sitting in the very same lounge waiting for their own business flights. They recognized the face on the federal manhunt broadcast and immediately connected it to the man standing frozen in a puddle of spilled champagne. The hushed whispers and pointing fingers started immediately. Bradley's pristine, untouchable corporate reputation was disintegrating in real time in front of his most important financial peers. He was completely exposed as the ultimate gullible mark. The reality of his colossal arrogance had finally caught up to him, breaking his mind into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. He was entirely isolated, trapped in an airport terminal, and legally bound to a federal fugitive. I leaned closer to the phone on my kitchen table, cutting directly through the chaotic noise of the lounge and the murmuring crowd. My voice crackled through the speaker, crisp, authoritative, and utterly devoid of mercy. I instructed the completely paralyzed man to pick up his fallen phone, open his highly encrypted Cayman Islands banking application, and check the balance of his offshore accounts right that very second. I heard the frantic scrambling sounds through the speaker as Bradley dropped to his knees on the floor of the VIP lounge. The clatter of his hands slapping against the polished tile painted a vivid picture of his absolute desperation. He fumbled wildly for the smartphone he had just dropped. His breathing was ragged and shallow, echoing through my kitchen like the desperate gasps of a drowning man. He managed to retrieve the device, and I heard the faint digital chime as he bypassed the lock screen. He was moving on pure primal panic now, completely stripped of his bespoke armor and societal arrogance. I listened as he navigated to the highly secure Cayman Islands banking application. The heavy silence on the line indicated he was aggressively tapping in his complex multi-character passwords and engaging the biometric scanners he had bragged about just minutes prior. He truly believed those military-grade encryptions were keeping his stolen wealth perfectly safe from the outside world. He failed to comprehend that the threat had never been on the outside. He had willingly invited the predator directly into the vault and handed her the master keys. The application loaded. I could almost feel the exact moment the encrypted interface illuminated his face with its harsh blue light. He swiped his finger across the glass, forcing the screen to refresh the main dashboard. A sharp, guttural sound ripped from his throat. It was not a word, but a raw, animalistic noise of pure, unadulterated shock. He refreshed the screen a second time and then a third. He aggressively tapped the glass over and over again, convinced the international banking server was simply experiencing a temporary glitch. But forensic ledgers do not glitch. The numbers displayed on his screen were absolute and final. The $3 million he had meticulously liquidated from our marital assets, the exact massive sum he had endlessly gloated about hiding from my divorce attorneys, was completely gone. The digital display stared back at him with a brutal, unforgiving zero balance. The liquid cash he had intended to use to build his new high society empire alongside his dream woman had been entirely vacuumed out of the holding company. Amber had executed her automated script with flawless precision, leaving behind an empty digital shell. Bradley began to hyperventilate right there in the middle of the crowded airport lounge. The reality of his colossal mistake was crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had sacrificed his marriage, his home, his reputation, and his entire financial foundation for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a profitable mark. He pressed the phone back to his ear, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form coherent syllables. He stammered my name, his tone completely devoid of the mocking superiority he had wielded like a weapon just moments ago. He sounded like a terrified, lost child. He begged me to tell him this was a mistake. He pleaded with me, claiming there had to be some sort of error in the routing protocol. When I remained perfectly silent, he shifted from denial to absolute desperation. The arrogant investment banker who had constantly belittled my career was suddenly begging the forensic accountant to save his life. He pleaded with me to use my federal clearance and my specialized tracking software to intercept the transaction. He told me I was the only person smart enough to trace the offshore transfers and retrieve the stolen capital. He frantically promised to give me back every single cent of the marital assets if I just helped him track down Amber before the money vanished into the dark web. He offered me apologies. He offered me control. He offered me anything I wanted if I would just apply my skills to fix the massive, catastrophic blunder he had committed. I sat at my kitchen table looking at Deandra and Connor. We shared a profound moment of silent victory. The poetic justice of him begging for the exact skills he had spent years degrading was incredibly satisfying. I leaned closer to the speakerphone, my voice dropping to a glacial, unforgiving temperature. I did not offer him a single shred of comfort. I did not accept his pathetic apologies or his desperate bargains. I explicitly reminded him that I had warned him to check his signature authorizations. I told him he had chosen to ignore my professional advice because his monumental ego convinced him he was the smartest person in the room. I stated firmly that I would absolutely never use my federal resources to assist a man who had actively attempted to render me homeless and destitute. I told him the $3 million was gone forever, swallowed by a ghost he had voluntarily married. I advised him to accept the fact that Amber had played him for an absolute fool and cleaned him out entirely. Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound entirely broken by the finality of my words. He sobbed into the receiver, repeating over and over that he was ruined. He cried that he had nothing left to his name. He was mourning the loss of his stolen wealth, completely blind to the actual danger rapidly approaching his location. He thought hitting a zero balance in his offshore account was the absolute worst-case scenario. He had no idea the trap had not even finished closing. I allowed him to cry for exactly 5 seconds before I interrupted his pathetic breakdown. My tone shifted from cold dismissal to lethal authority. I instructed him to stop crying over the missing $3 million. I coldly informed him that the evaporated offshore cash was actually the absolute least of his current problems. I told him losing his stolen marital assets was merely the opening act of his financial destruction. I instructed the weeping, paralyzed man to minimize his empty Cayman Islands application, open his domestic corporate banking portal, and immediately check the active status of his $5 million commercial loan. Bradley's thumb shook so violently he could barely navigate away from the empty offshore account. He swiped across his phone screen, leaving smears of cold sweat on the glass as he frantically opened his domestic corporate banking portal. He desperately prayed that the $5 million commercial loan was still sitting safely in the approved queue, waiting for his final authorization to bridge the catastrophic gap Amber had just ripped into his finances. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the dashboard finally materialized. The screen did not display the pristine green numbers of a successfully underwritten loan. Instead, the entire interface was completely flooded with harsh, glaring red notification banners. A massive critical alert box dominated the center of the display, indicating a catastrophic default protocol had been triggered by the automated underwriting system. Bradley tapped the alert, his vision blurring, as he tried to comprehend the dense financial jargon sprawling across the screen. The bank had attempted their standard final verification of the physical collateral precisely at the opening of the business day. Because Deandra and I had securely locked the deed to my suburban house inside an impenetrable, irrevocable trust 2 weeks prior, the bank's automated query hit a solid legal brick wall. The system instantly recognized that Bradley no longer possessed a single ounce of equity in the property he had aggressively pledged. The system immediately classified the $5 million loan as dangerously unsecured. When the bank's security software simultaneously detected the massive, highly suspicious $3 million withdrawal from his linked marital accounts, it executed a mandatory financial lockdown. The commercial loan was instantly revoked and marked for immediate federal fraud investigation. Bradley's breathing devolved into shallow, ragged gasps. He frantically navigated to the digital signature registry attached to the corporate application, desperately searching for Madison's name. He needed to prove that his new high society bride was a co-signer, that she was equally liable for the massive financial commitments they had structured together. He scoured the electronic documents, opening every single PDF file and routing authorization form tied to the phantom cryptocurrency portfolio. He found absolutely nothing. Amber had executed a flawless digital scrubbing protocol. She had meticulously erased every single trace of her involvement from the corporate infrastructure. She had routed her initial communications through encrypted proxies, masked her IP addresses, and manipulated the digital DocuSign platforms to ensure her actual legal identity never touched a single binding contract. The only signature explicitly securing the fraudulent loan applications, the falsified tax evasion documents, and the international routing numbers was Bradley's. He was entirely alone on the paperwork. He had voluntarily signed away his life while blinded by the illusion of a wealthy, subservient wife. I listened to his ragged breathing through the open phone line, projecting my voice with lethal, unwavering clarity. I broke down the exact reality of his situation, leaving no room for denial. I informed him that the suspicious activity report I had hard-coded with Deandra the previous night had functioned perfectly. I explained that by attempting to leverage an asset he did not legally own to secure a massive corporate loan, he had committed textbook federal wire and mortgage fraud. I told him that the Internal Revenue Service was currently processing the falsified tax documents he had submitted to shield his stolen marital assets. Because Amber was completely gone and legally non-existent on the paperwork, he was the sole individual responsible for defrauding a commercial bank and attempting to launder millions of dollars across international borders. He had built his own perfect prison and locked himself inside. Bradley dropped his phone onto the polished side table of the lounge, entirely incapable of formulating a response. He gripped his hair with both hands, pulling hard, as if trying to wake himself from a horrific nightmare. The luxurious reality of his first-class morning had entirely dissolved, leaving him trapped in a terrifying state of freefall. He was a man who had built his entire identity on projecting financial superiority and absolute control over women. Now he was completely bankrupted, publicly humiliated, and facing decades in federal prison because he thought he was smarter than the forensic accountant he had treated like garbage for years. He sat frozen in the plush leather armchair, staring blankly at the shattered champagne glass on the floor. Over the open speakerphone connection, I could hear the ambient sounds of the airport terminal shifting significantly. The polite murmurs of wealthy travelers and the soft clinking of coffee cups abruptly ceased. A tense, heavy silence rapidly swept through the exclusive VIP lounge, replacing the relaxed atmosphere of luxury travel. The silence was immediately broken by a highly distinct rhythmic sound, echoing loudly across the marble floors of the outer concourse. It was not the casual shuffle of dragging luggage or the hurried pace of a late passenger. It was the heavy synchronized sound of tactical boots marching with absolute unwavering purpose directly toward the frosted glass doors of the first-class lounge. The frosted glass doors of the exclusive airport lounge were violently shoved open, breaking the quiet tension of the room. A highly coordinated tactical unit of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers boldly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division flooded into the luxury space. They bypassed the shocked concierge entirely, moving with a rapid, practiced efficiency that immediately signaled a high-level federal takedown. The agents fanned out across the plush carpeting, their eyes scanning the room until they locked directly onto their high-profile target. Bradley remained frozen in his leather armchair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the reality crashing down upon him. He did not attempt to run. He did not attempt to speak. He simply stared blankly at the approaching agents, as if his brain had entirely shut down to protect him from the horrific trauma of his own consequences. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern, uncompromising expression, marched directly up to Bradley. He did not offer polite greetings or professional courtesy. He loudly and authoritatively instructed Bradley to stand up and place his hands squarely behind his head. The command echoed through the silent lounge, causing the surrounding wealthy patrons to gasp in collective shock. Prominent business executives and high society travelers immediately pulled out their smartphones, eager to document the spectacular downfall of their arrogant peer. Bradley moved mechanically, slowly rising from his chair and placing his shaking hands behind his neck. The agents moved in instantly, patting him down for concealed weapons before violently stripping him of his personal devices, including the phone that was still actively broadcasting the entire ordeal to my kitchen table. I listened intently as the metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, permanently shattering his untouchable corporate facade. Just as the lead agent began reciting the federal charges, a sudden chaotic commotion erupted near the entrance of the lounge. A shrill, piercing voice cut through the professional commands of the federal authorities. It was Beverly. She had apparently driven to the airport early, specifically to see her golden child and his wealthy new bride off on their luxurious honeymoon. She marched past the concierge desk wearing a vibrant designer pantsuit, completely oblivious to the severe federal operation taking place. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she saw her precious son surrounded by tactical agents and bound in steel handcuffs. For a fraction of a second, she simply stared, her mind unable to comprehend the visual of her perfect boy being treated like a common criminal. Then Beverly completely lost her mind. She let out a deafening theatrical shriek and lunged forward aggressively, attempting to physically push her way through the perimeter of federal agents to reach her son. She wildly waved her designer handbag, shouting at the top of her lungs that this was a massive, catastrophic mistake. She demanded the agents release her son immediately, aggressively, asserting her social status and claiming she personally knew the mayor and several prominent judges. She yelled that Bradley was a highly respected investment banker who came from a pristine background and that they were arresting the wrong man. She desperately tried to tell them that the real criminal was the fake heiress, Madison, who had stolen everything. She pointed frantic fingers, screaming that her son was completely innocent and a victim of a horrible misunderstanding. The federal agents did not care about her social standing or her shrill demands. 2 officers immediately stepped in her path, creating a solid physical wall that stopped her frantic charge. They firmly instructed her to step back and cease interfering with an active federal arrest, warning her that any further physical contact would result in her own immediate detention for obstructing justice. Beverly hit the impenetrable wall of federal authority and completely crumbled. The arrogant, toxic woman who had spent years making me feel completely worthless was suddenly reduced to a hysterical, powerless spectator. She stood crying uncontrollably, surrounded by the disgusted stares of her wealthy peers, completely incapable of protecting her son from the devastating consequences of his own monumental arrogance. She could not blame me. She could not blame the firm. She could only watch in absolute horror as the boy she had raised to believe he was invincible was dragged away in disgrace. Through the confiscated phone lying on the table, I heard the lead agent's voice cut through Beverly's hysterical sobbing. His tone was sharp and unyielding as he formally recited the Miranda rights, reading Bradley, his rights regarding wire fraud, mortgage fraud, and massive federal tax evasion. The words echoed loudly, representing the absolute destruction of the toxic empire Bradley and Beverly had built together. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the glowing monitors and the undeniable proof of my hard-fought victory. I looked at Deandra and Connor, who were watching me with expressions of profound respect and immense pride. I reached forward and pressed the digital button to end the call, permanently silencing the chaotic noise of my abusers. The chaotic energy of the morning seamlessly transitioned into the refined, low-lit elegance of a premier Chicago steakhouse later that evening. The rich aroma of dry-aged beef, truffle butter, and roasted garlic filled the air, providing a stark contrast to the sterile anxiety of the previous days. I sat at a private curved mahogany booth, tucked away in the most exclusive corner of the restaurant. Deandra sat to my right, looking utterly radiant in a tailored sapphire dress, while Connor sat across from us, pouring a dark, heavy vintage red wine into our crystal glasses. The soft ambient sounds of jazz music and clinking silverware washed over us, creating an atmosphere of absolute peace and profound victory. We raised our glasses together, the crystal chiming brightly, as we celebrated the flawless execution of our defensive strategy and the permanent elimination of the toxic forces that had plagued my life for years. The aftermath of the morning's events was nothing short of spectacularly comprehensive. My personal assets were fortified behind an impenetrable wall of legal protection. Because Deandra had successfully locked the deed to my home inside the irrevocable trust well before Bradley attempted his fraudulent maneuvers, the commercial bank immediately cleared my name of any liability regarding the defaulted $5 million loan. The house was entirely secure, remaining my sole unencumbered property. Furthermore, the immediate freezing of my business accounts that Bradley had spitefully attempted was permanently dismissed by the presiding judge, who reviewed the extensive evidence of his malicious intent. My forensic accounting firm suffered absolutely zero financial disruption, allowing my professional life to continue without a single blemish on my pristine record. Bradley, on the other hand, was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison, while his mother Beverly was left completely socially exiled, too humiliated to ever show her face at a country club again. But the victory extended far beyond mere survival and basic asset protection. The meticulous digital pipeline I had constructed with Connor and the comprehensive suspicious activity report I had drafted did much more than just trigger Bradley's immediate arrest. My forensic analysis had effectively mapped Amber's entire international routing network, exposing the highly guarded digital pathways her syndicate utilized to launder stolen capital. I formally submitted my extensive private dossier to the lead federal investigators overseeing the manhunt. The FBI agents were completely astounded by the depth and accuracy of my independent forensic work. They immediately utilized my detailed routing algorithms to intercept multiple pending offshore transfers, successfully freezing millions of dollars in stolen funds before the syndicate could vanish completely into the dark web. My actions provided the exact critical evidence the federal task force desperately needed to close their major multi-state investigation and aggressively dismantle a massive portion of the serial fraud ring. The professional ramifications of handing the FBI a fully wrapped major federal fraud case were absolutely staggering. When the senior partners at my forensic accounting firm reviewed the incredible scope of my independent investigation and witnessed the direct praise from the federal authorities, they immediately called an emergency board meeting. They recognized that my unparalleled analytical skills and ironclad legal defenses had not only saved my own life, but had significantly elevated the firm's prestige within the federal contracting space. The very next morning, I was formally called into the executive suite and offered a massive, unprecedented promotion to Senior Director of Federal Investigations. The promotion came with a highly lucrative equity stake in the firm, a sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline, and a substantial salary increase that secured my financial independence forever. The career that Bradley had constantly belittled as boring and pathetic had ultimately become the exact weapon that destroyed him and elevated me to the absolute pinnacle of my industry. I sat in the comfortable leather booth of the steakhouse, looking warmly at my brother and my brilliant sister-in-law. We enjoyed the perfectly seared steaks and the decadent side dishes, reveling in the quiet joy of a hard-fought battle successfully won. I had defeated the people who spent years trying to break my spirit, and I did it without throwing a single physical punch, without engaging in screaming matches, and without stooping to their pathetic levels of toxic manipulation. I had dismantled their abusive empire, using nothing but pure intellect, ironclad legal boundaries, and the flawless execution of the law. I had weaponized my own intelligence to protect myself and allowed their own blinding greed to serve as their executioner. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the heavy red wine, letting the rich, complex flavors coat my palate. I looked out the large restaurant window at the bright, glittering lights of the Chicago skyline stretching out into the cold night. The crushing weight of my past marriage and the toxic burden of my former in-laws were completely gone, evaporated like the stolen funds in an offshore account. I took a deep breath of the calm, peaceful air, looking forward to a brilliant, completely unburdened future. To give you the best quality without the story abruptly stopping mid-sentence, I have written a massive, detailed continuation below that pushes the narrative forward, focusing on Paige's new life, the ultimate downfall of Beverly, and the thrilling international hunt for Amber. If you love this direction, we can keep going chunk by chunk until we hit your 5,000-word goal. The weeks following the steakhouse dinner moved with a relentless and deeply satisfying momentum. I stepped into my new corner office on the 42nd floor with a profound sense of ownership. The expansive glass windows offered a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline, reflecting the immense scale of my new responsibilities. My promotion to Senior Director of Federal Investigations was not merely a ceremonial title. It came with a dedicated team of elite forensic analysts and direct liaison privileges with the Department of Justice. My very first official act in this new capacity was to deepen the collaborative net around the phantom bride who had completely evaded the initial airport takedown. Amber was a ghost, but ghosts who deal in stolen millions always leave a digital wake. I sat at my new mahogany desk poring over the secondary layers of the Cayman Islands routing protocols. The FBI had successfully frozen the bulk of the stolen assets, but Amber had managed to slip through the international dragnet, utilizing a secondary passport and a highly sophisticated network of physical cash couriers. Bradley, meanwhile, was experiencing the catastrophic reality of the federal justice system. Deandra kept me updated on his legal proceedings purely for my own amusement and strategic awareness. He was currently being held in a federal detention center without bail. The presiding judge had viewed him as a significant flight risk, citing his attempt to board an international flight with millions of dollars in highly suspicious offshore accounts. His defense attorneys were frantically trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer volume of evidence I had handed to the prosecutors made any leniency entirely impossible. Beverly was completely spiraling into a state of absolute social and financial ruin. With Bradley's assets seized by the federal government and his corporate accounts frozen pending the fraud investigation, Beverly found herself completely cut off from the lavish lifestyle she had lorded over me for years. She attempted to leverage her high society connections to secure top-tier legal representation for her son, but the elite circle she so desperately clung to had entirely turned their backs on her. The wealthy socialites and corporate power brokers wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family currently plastered across the evening news for committing federal mortgage fraud and laundering money for a known international criminal. Beverly was forced to downsize her life drastically, selling her luxury vehicles and moving out of her pristine gated community into a remarkably average apartment complex. The poetic justice of her ending up in the exact type of modest housing she used to mercilessly mock was a detail I thoroughly enjoyed. My focus, however, remained entirely on the unresolved variable of Amber. The federal task force invited me to a classified briefing at the regional field office to dissect her escape route. I stood in a secure conference room surrounded by seasoned agents projecting a highly complex map of global financial movements onto the main screen. I explained that while Amber had successfully boarded a flight to a non-extradition jurisdiction, She had made a single microscopic miscalculation in her exit strategy. She assumed her primary shell companies were entirely burned and had attempted to quietly activate a dormant sleeper account located in Geneva to fund her continued evasion. What she did not realize was that during my initial weekend audit, I had identified the digital signature of that exact sleeper account and intentionally left it open, weaving a silent tracking algorithm directly into its core architecture. The lead FBI agent, a stoic man who rarely smiled, looked at my projected data with a mixture of absolute shock and profound respect. I detailed exactly how the tracking algorithm functioned. The moment Amber attempted to access the Geneva funds to pay her international facilitators, the system would not freeze the money. Instead, it would silently approve the transaction while simultaneously pinging her exact physical geolocation through the bank's security authentication protocols. We did not have to hunt her across the globe. We simply had to wait for her to run out of the cash she carried in her designer luggage and inevitably reach for the digital reserves. The trap snapped shut 3 weeks later. I was sitting in my office reviewing a domestic corporate fraud case when my direct secure line to the federal task force chimed. The lead agent informed me that the Geneva account had just been pinged from a luxury hotel in Vienna. Amber had attempted to wire funds to secure a long-term rental property, believing she was completely safe in a country with complex banking privacy laws. But my algorithm had instantly pierced the veil, transmitting her exact coordinates to Interpol. International authorities moved with blistering speed, coordinating with local law enforcement to apprehend her directly in the hotel lobby before she could even finish her morning artisan coffee. The news of her capture sent shockwaves through the global financial sector, bringing absolute closure to the massive syndicate investigation. I received the news with a quiet, satisfying sense of absolute finality. The final loose end of the nightmare was securely tied. I walked out of my office that evening feeling the crisp Chicago air against my face. I met Deandra and Connor for a casual dinner at a quiet neighborhood bistro, a stark contrast to the high-end steakhouse, but infinitely more comforting. We did not discuss Bradley or Beverly or Amber. We talked about the future, about upcoming family holidays that would be completely free of toxic manipulation, and about the incredible trajectory of our respective careers. I had reclaimed my life, my assets, and my profound sense of self-worth. I had transformed the darkest betrayal into the absolute greatest victory of my professional and personal life. The woman who was once told she was nothing but a boring, unglamorous accountant had single-handedly dismantled a global fraud ring and sent her abusers straight into the unforgiving arms of federal justice. And the best part was that I was only just getting started. Would you like me to continue generating the next segment focusing on Bradley's explosive criminal trial and the final courtroom showdown? The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago stood as an imposing monument to absolute justice. 6 months had passed since the spectacular airport takedown, and the changing seasons had brought a bitter, biting chill to the city. I walked through the security checkpoint flanked by Deandra and Connor, feeling completely insulated from the freezing wind outside. Today was the official commencement of Bradley's federal criminal trial. The grand jury had indicted him on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe tax evasion based entirely on the airtight forensic dossier I had provided to the authorities. We took our seats in the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. The courtroom was packed with journalists, financial reporters, and curious spectators eager to witness the highly publicized downfall of a former investment banking golden boy. I sat with perfect posture, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet, unbothered authority. A sudden hush fell over the crowded room as the side door opened and the federal marshals escorted Bradley into the defendant's seating area. The transformation was absolutely staggering. The man who had once terrorized my life with bespoke Italian suits and vintage champagne was now swimming in an oversized neon orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive haircut had grown out into an unkempt, messy style, and his posture was completely defeated. His shoulders slumped forward, entirely stripped of the arrogant, confident swagger he had weaponized against me for years. He looked deeply exhausted, terrified, and remarkably small. I watched him scan the gallery with wide, desperate eyes. He was looking for a friendly face, but he found absolutely no one. His former corporate colleagues had entirely abandoned him, refusing to associate with a toxic, indicted felon. Beverly was sitting 2 rows behind him, and her appearance was equally shocking. The once formidable matriarch of suburban high society was practically unrecognizable. Without access to Bradley's stolen funds and frozen corporate accounts, she could no longer afford the constant cosmetic upkeep and designer wardrobes she had relied on to project superiority. She wore a simple faded beige coat, and her hair lacked its usual pristine volume. She looked completely withered, clutching a cheap tissue in her shaking hands. When Bradley looked back at her, she offered him a weak, pathetic smile, but he immediately looked away, unable to face the reality of their shared destruction. Beverly caught my eye across the wooden benches. I did not look away. I held her gaze with absolute icy neutrality until she nervously dropped her head to stare at her shoes, entirely unable to withstand the weight of my silent judgment. The presiding judge entered the courtroom, demanding immediate order. The prosecution began outlining their opening statements, delivering a masterclass in legal dismantling. The lead prosecutor, a sharp, meticulous woman, painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a greedy, arrogant man who believed he was entirely above the law. She explicitly detailed how Bradley had aggressively attempted to leverage his former marital home to secure a fraudulent $5 million commercial loan. She walked the jury through the exact timeline of his offshore transfers, utilizing my forensic data to explain how he had willfully engaged in massive international money laundering. Every single word she spoke hammered another nail into his metaphorical coffin. Bradley sat frozen at the defense table, staring blankly at his own hands as his entire life was surgically dissected for the public record. He had no defense. He had no leverage. He was entirely trapped in a cage constructed by his own monumental hubris. Deandra leaned over and whispered that the defense attorney looked visibly nauseous. She was right. Bradley's public defender, an overworked lawyer assigned by the court because Bradley's assets were totally frozen, looked completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of irrefutable digital evidence. The defense strategy was clearly grasping at straws, hoping to shift the blame entirely onto the mysterious fugitive bride. But the prosecution immediately preempted that pathetic defense by announcing their star witness. They informed the jury that the government had successfully extradited the international fraudster known as Amber from Vienna, and she had officially accepted a highly restrictive plea deal. In exchange for a slightly reduced federal sentence, Amber had agreed to testify completely and transparently against Bradley, outlining exactly how his own aggressive greed made the entire fraudulent operation possible. Bradley's head snapped up, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. He realized his fake high-society wife was about to take the stand and bury him alive. The courtroom doors swung open, and the federal marshals escorted Amber into the room. She was no longer wearing the custom silk designer wedding gown she had flaunted at the Four Seasons reception. She wore standard-issue federal prison attire, her hands securely cuffed in front of her waist. Her previously flawless hair was pulled back into a severe practical ponytail, and her face was entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she had used to craft her aristocratic disguise. Yet she walked with a strange, chilling confidence, taking the witness stand with the calm demeanor of a seasoned professional calculating her best possible angle. She swore the oath and adjusted the microphone, preparing to deliver the testimony that would guarantee Bradley's permanent residence in a federal penitentiary. The prosecution wasted absolutely no time, diving straight into the mechanics of the financial scam. The lead attorney asked Amber to describe exactly how she selected Bradley as her primary target. Amber leaned forward and spoke with total clinical detachment. She explained that she specifically sought out men in the finance sector who possessed massive unchecked egos and deep insecurities, regarding their social status. She stated clearly for the official court record that Bradley was an incredibly easy mark because he was completely blinded by his desperate need to project superiority over his former wife. She told the jury that Bradley constantly complained about my forensic accounting career, calling me boring and unglamorous. Amber realized immediately that she could manipulate his hatred for me by simply pretending to be everything I was, not subservient, immensely wealthy, and completely reliant on his supposed masculine financial brilliance. Bradley buried his face in his hands physically, unable to listen to the humiliating truth being broadcast to the entire courtroom. Amber continued her testimony detailing the exact conversations they had shared regarding the marital assets. She confirmed under oath that it was Bradley's explicit original idea to liquidate the $3 million to hide it from the divorce settlement. She told the jury that she merely suggested utilizing a specific Cayman Islands holding company, and Bradley aggressively jumped at the opportunity to commit tax evasion. She clarified that he actively forged the loan documents and willfully leveraged the suburban house without a single shred of coercion on her part. She stated that his absolute blinding greed made him volunteer for the fraud because he wanted the $5 million commercial loan to launch a new vanity investment firm to compete with his peers. The defense attorney attempted a desperate cross-examination, trying to paint Amber as a manipulative mastermind who completely brainwashed an innocent investment banker. Amber simply laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed through the quiet room. She looked directly at Bradley's lawyer and stated that she never forced him to sign a single fraudulent document. She explained that she never held a weapon to his head or threatened his life. She merely created an illusion, and Bradley gleefully sprinted toward the mirage because he thought he was pulling off the ultimate corporate heist against his ex-wife. She looked straight at the jury and delivered the most devastating line of the entire trial. She said a con artist can only steal from a man who is already actively looking for a way to cheat the system. Bradley was a willing, enthusiastic participant in his own financial destruction. The impact of her testimony was absolute and undeniable. The jury looked at Bradley with pure, undisguised disgust. They did not see a victim of a clever international scam. They saw a greedy, vindictive man who had happily broken multiple federal laws simply to punish his former wife and inflate his own pathetic ego. Deandra nodded approvingly from our bench, recognizing that Amber's cold, calculated testimony had completely annihilated any possibility of a sympathetic defense narrative. Beverly was openly weeping in the gallery behind us, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, as the reality of her son's impending massive prison sentence finally penetrated her thick layers of suburban denial. The prosecution rested their case, leaving Bradley entirely exposed, defenseless, and completely stripped of the arrogant pride he had wielded like a weapon for his entire adult life. The following morning, the prosecution called me to the witness stand to serve as the definitive expert voice on the financial mechanics of the fraud. I walked past Bradley's defense table, maintaining a posture of total, unbothered professionalism. I swore the oath and took my seat looking out over the packed courtroom. I spotted Connor and Deandra smiling encouragingly from the front row. I adjusted the microphone and waited for the lead prosecutor to begin her direct examination. My role was not to provide emotional testimony or discuss the toxic dynamics of my failed marriage. My sole purpose was to present the raw, unassailable data proving Bradley's direct and voluntary execution of multiple severe federal crimes. The prosecutor projected the massive digital spreadsheets and encrypted transaction logs onto the large courtroom monitors. These were the exact documents I had compiled during my intense weekend audit with Deandra and Connor. I methodically walked the jury through the complex labyrinth of offshore routing numbers, shell company incorporations, and forged guarantor signatures. I explained the data with crisp, accessible language, translating the dense financial jargon into a clear, cohesive narrative of premeditated theft. I demonstrated exactly how Bradley's unique digital signature authorized the $3 million transfer, breaking down the precise timestamps that correlated perfectly with his active usage of his secure banking application. I left absolutely no room for alternative interpretations or technical glitches. The defense attorney attempted to rattle me during his cross-examination. He paced aggressively in front of the stand, questioning my objectivity. He suggested that as a bitter divorced wife, I had a clear personal motivation to fabricate this financial data to destroy my former husband. He tried to frame my forensic investigation as a vindictive witch hunt designed to frame an innocent man. I did not raise my voice or take the emotional bait. I calmly reminded the defense counsel that mathematics does not possess the capacity for jealousy or spite. I pointed to the projected server logs and stated that the digital footprint was verified, authenticated, and independently corroborated by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him my personal feelings regarding the defendant were entirely irrelevant to the fact that his client committed federal mortgage fraud using my stolen Social Security number. The defense lawyer pushed harder, attempting to find a microscopic crack in my composure. He demanded to know how I had magically gained access to highly secure offshore holding company names. He implied I had engaged in illegal cyber espionage to acquire the data, thereby rendering the evidence inadmissible. I offered him a polite, clinical smile. I informed the court that my professional position as a senior director of federal investigations provided me with top-tier security clearances. I explained that the specific shell company Amber utilized was already part of an active classified federal database I managed. I stated that tracking Bradley's clumsy, aggressive financial movements was an incredibly basic task for an auditor with my specific credentials. I told the lawyer that his client did not require a sophisticated cyber attack to be caught, because his client had left a digital trail so wide and messy it could be tracked by a first-year accounting student. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur of amusement, causing the judge to bang her gavel for order. The defense attorney's face flushed a deep shade of crimson, realizing he had just walked blindly into a trap of his own making. He had attempted to discredit my expertise and instead gave me the perfect platform to highlight Bradley's sheer monumental incompetence. Bradley stared at the defense table, looking thoroughly destroyed. The man who had constantly mocked my career was now being completely dismantled by it on the permanent public record. I stepped down from the witness stand, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. I had not yelled, I had not cried, and I had not resorted to petty insults. I had simply presented the cold, hard truth and allowed the absolute weight of the law to crush the people who had tried to break me. The jury deliberations lasted less than 4 hours. The sheer overwhelming mountain of digital evidence, witness testimony, and corroborated financial records left absolutely no room for reasonable doubt. The courtroom was tense and silent as the jury foreperson stood to read the final verdict. I sat between Deandra and Connor, maintaining my calm composure as the judge asked the defendant to rise. Bradley stood on trembling legs, looking absolutely terrified. The foreperson read through the extensive list of severe federal charges, finding the defendant guilty of wire fraud, guilty of bank fraud, guilty of aggravated identity theft, and guilty of massive federal tax evasion. With every single guilty pronouncement, Bradley's shoulders sagged further until he looked like he might physically collapse onto the wooden defense table. The sentencing phase followed immediately, bringing the absolute finality of the justice system crashing down on the toxic family. The presiding judge delivered a blistering reprimand before handing down the final sentence. She explicitly noted that Bradley's crimes were not born of desperation or necessity, but of pure, unadulterated, malicious greed. She highlighted his aggressive attempt to financially ruin his former spouse while laundering money to fund a fraudulent luxury lifestyle. The judge slammed her gavel down and sentenced Bradley to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists for the final time, marking the absolute end of his arrogant reign. A piercing, devastated scream echoed from the back of the gallery. Beverly completely lost whatever remaining grip she had on reality. She collapsed onto the wooden bench, sobbing hysterically, and wailing that her perfect, beautiful boy had been stolen from her. She reached her hands out toward the front of the courtroom, begging the federal marshals to show mercy, demanding they arrest me instead. The judge immediately ordered the bailiffs to remove the disruptive woman from the courtroom. I watched impassively as two armed guards grabbed Beverly by the arms and physically dragged her out through the heavy oak doors. Her shrill, dramatic cries faded down the long marble hallway, ending the generational cycle of toxic suburban superiority once and for all. She had lost her wealth, she had lost her social standing, and she had permanently lost the golden child she had weaponized against me for years. I walked out of the federal courthouse feeling the crisp, clean Chicago wind against my face. The heavy, burdensome chapter of my past was officially completely closed. Deandra pulled me into a fierce, supportive hug while Connor proudly clapped my shoulder. We stood on the wide concrete steps, looking out at the bustling city moving around us. Reporters shouted questions from behind the security barricades, attempting to get a final statement from the woman who had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of a corrupt financial executive. I ignored the flashing cameras and the demanding journalists. I had absolutely nothing left to say to the public. My actions, my boundaries, and my flawless execution of the law had spoken volumes louder than any press release ever could. We walked to Deandra's sleek black car parked near the curb. I slid into the comfortable leather seat, feeling a deep, radiating warmth spreading through my chest. The paralyzing anxiety that had haunted the final years of my marriage was completely eradicated. I was no longer the unappreciated, overworked wife striving for the approval of a toxic, narcissistic family. I was a highly respected senior executive, a brilliant forensic auditor, and a woman who possessed the ultimate power of absolute financial and emotional independence. The engine purred to life, and we pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the wreckage of Bradley and Beverly far behind us in the rearview mirror. 5 years later, the Chicago skyline sparkled brightly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my massive corner office. My career trajectory had continued its aggressive upward climb, cementing my status as one of the most feared and respected forensic accounting partners in the entire Midwest. The firm had expanded significantly, and I now managed a specialized international task force dedicated entirely to dismantling high-level corporate fraud syndicates. My financial portfolio was robust and impenetrable, secured by the same brilliant legal structures Deandra had initially designed to protect my suburban home. I had sold that house years ago, utilizing the substantial profits to purchase a stunning modern penthouse right in the heart of the city, entirely free of any toxic suburban memories. My personal life flourished in the absence of Bradley's suffocating arrogance. I spent my weekends traveling the world, attending high-end culinary classes, and enjoying the precise, quiet luxury I had earned through my own relentless hard work. Connor and Deandra remained my absolute closest confidants, frequently joining me for rooftop dinners and celebrating our collective professional victories. We had built a chosen family rooted entirely in mutual respect, fierce loyalty, and genuine unconditional support. The dark shadow of my former in-laws never breached the perimeter of my new reality. Bradley remained incarcerated, serving his lengthy sentence in a bleak federal facility stripped of his designer suits and his false superiority. Beverly, having burned through her last remaining social bridges, had reportedly moved to a small rural town in a different state, living in complete bitter isolation. I decided to utilize a significant portion of my firm equity to establish a specialized educational foundation. I created a comprehensive mentorship and scholarship program specifically designed to support young women entering the fields of forensic accounting and corporate law. I wanted to ensure the next generation of female professionals possessed the exact analytical tools and legal armor required to protect themselves from financial predators and toxic corporate environments. The foundation grew rapidly, hosting annual galas and funding full-ride university scholarships for brilliant, determined students who reminded me of myself before I learned how to fight back. On the anniversary of the explosive airport takedown, I hosted an elegant private dinner for my foundation's graduating class at the exact same high-end steakhouse where Deandra, Connor, and I had celebrated our initial victory. The private room was filled with the vibrant, energetic voices of young women ready to conquer the financial sector. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, raising a crystal glass of premium vintage red wine. I looked around the room, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I delivered a brief, powerful toast about the vital importance of maintaining ironclad boundaries, trusting your own intellect, and refusing to let anyone diminish your professional worth. The young women raised their glasses, cheering enthusiastically. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the rich, complex wine, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. I looked out the large glass window, watching the vibrant city lights reflecting off the dark surface of the river below. I had survived a catastrophic betrayal, dismantled a massive federal fraud ring, and built an entirely new, beautiful existence from the ground up. I had weaponized my truth and reclaimed my absolute power. The woman who was once mocked for being boring and unglamorous had become the architect of her own magnificent, completely unburdened destiny. I smiled a genuine bright expression of pure victory and turned back to the celebration completely ready for whatever brilliant challenges the future held. The most profound lesson to draw from these experiences is that your inherent worth is never determined by other people's inability to recognize it. When faced with exclusion, betrayal, or toxic family dynamics, our first instinct is often to internalize the rejection, to ask ourselves what we did wrong, or how we can change to finally be accepted. However, true empowerment comes when we stop auditioning for a seat at a table where we aren't valued. When the people who are supposed to protect and include you choose to shut you out. The healthiest response is not to beg for entry or lash out in destructive revenge. The ultimate act of self-care and the most devastating response to those who underestimate you is to simply create your own space. Setting firm boundaries and refusing to accept the false narratives others project onto you allows you to reclaim your power. It teaches us that family isn't solely defined by shared DNA. It is built on mutual respect, authentic support, and choosing the people who genuinely celebrate your presence. Walking away from toxic environments to forge your own path, whether that means leaning into a chosen family, focusing on your own success, or finding peace in solitude, requires immense courage. Yet it is within that newly claimed space that you finally discover your own strength, unburdened by the weight of someone else's expectations. You learn that true dignity lies in walking away from disrespect with your head held high, proving that you do not need their validation to thrive. Take a moment today to evaluate your boundaries and start building a space that truly honors your worth. Have you ever had to create your own space when others wouldn't make room for you? Share your story in the comments below.